All right, let's start with this book by Frederick Forsyth, the beloved writer of Igbo people. Like I always say, he's a propagandist with all due respect, because when he writes, the things he writes, it takes a lot more faith. Let me put it this way. So I think that some writers write like their readers are stupid. I think he's one of those writers. And if you're a reader and if you read books and you notice that the person who is writing is acting as if you're stupid, there's a way you're going to begin to act when you read such person's books. So, yeah. But let's start with him, because of course there are some good things that we can learn from. In the autumn of 1964, Emeka, that's Chukwuemeka Ojukwu, called a meeting of the Nigerian staff officers in Lagos and put to them a question. No British officers were asked to attend. The question was this: Nigeria's president was by then an Easterner of the NCNC party. Although a non-executive president, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe was also holder of the title of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. But the democratically elected government was of the NPC party, headed by Alhaji Tafawa Balewa, under whom the defense minister was Alhaji Ribadu. In the event of a political crisis and in the event of conflicting orders from president and premier, whom should the army obey? A little background: we had a constitutional issue at the time in Nigeria between the president and the prime minister, and that's the basis for the question Ojukwu is asking his colleagues. No one knew what the question that Ojukwu asked. What was the question Ojukwu asked? In the event of a political crisis and in the event of conflicting orders from president and premier, whom should the army obey? No one knew. No one had the faintest idea. No one had ever thought of it before. They agreed that Emeka should find out exactly where they all stood, and as quickly as possible. He resolved to consult the British General of Officer Commanding, General Welby Everard. But before he could do so, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, who had attended the meeting and said nothing, had run to General Welby with a tale that Emeka was holding political meetings. Let's jump to what Welby then told them. The general, that's Welby Everard, consulted the Attorney General and got the ruling. It was clear. In the event of conflict, the officer corps should obey the democratically elected political leader of the country, the Prime Minister, or his subordinates, the Defense Minister. Let's stop there for now. This is going to take us a bit backwards, but it's like one shooter or so. We'll go back small. Ojukwu is asking what to do if there are conflicting orders. When you read the book or the document by Odiel Femom, makes it very clear that Ojukwu in that period also met with Azikiwe and spoke to Azikiwe about the possibility of a coup. This was in 64. And then there's another document by David Ejo, the first military governor of Midwest. The book is called Reminiscences. And he said in that book that Ojukwu was planning a coup. There was an interview as well. He said in the interview as well that Ojukwu was planning a coup in 1964, himself and Bassi, and then they were going to work with 3 other people. That would be Victor Banjo, himself, David Ejo, and Yakubu Gowon. And they were able to convince Victor Banjo, according to David Ejo. But when they got to David Ejo and Yakubu Gowon, they went to report to their boss at the time, who was General Foster. When you put the 3 sources together, what you see essentially is the fact that there was a political crisis, by the way, eventually led to house arrest or detention, so to speak, issued by the Prime Minister, that kept the president indoors, until of course he eventually had to form government with Tafawa Balewa. But while all this was going on, David Ejo said that folks from the southeast had a problem with what was going on. But just so that doesn't look like I'm just talking, let me read David Ejo's own account. So please let me open that. So he says, first of all, let me tell you this. When the British were here, who is speaking here? David Ejo, right? David Ejo, that was the first military governor of Midwest. First of all, let me tell you this. When the British were here, we were the last Nigerian officers to be commanded by the British soldiers. The senior person to me in Nigeria was Bassi. The second was Aguiyi Ironsi. The Igbos wanted to rule. Why they wanted to rule was that Nnamdi Azikiwe was the then Governor General and more or less head of state. The constitution did not give any power to Azikiwe, so this annoyed the Igbo people, and they used to say, how can we run a constitution in which the head of state cannot advise the government? The government cannot contact the head of state for any advice. So the answer was, well, to take over since they were already leading and yet they had no control over the government. That was why the Igbo soldiers decided to organize a coup. This is not the one of 66, so this is 1964. Please stay with me. But at that time, there were 4 major leading officers, which included me, Yakubu Gowon, Basi, and Ojukwu. Igbo people relied on Ojukwu for the coup, and they were able to convince the Yoruba, which Yoruba, Victor Banjo, you'll see it later on. Ojukwu and Banjo now contacted me and Gowon for a coup, but we refused. Gowon and I refused, and they went on their own, but we then reported that to the European officer, General Foster. I and Gowon reported to him that some people were trying to plan a coup. He called all of us, the Nigerian army officers, and advised us not to organize any military coup. So that gives us an idea of what was happening in 1964. And like I mentioned earlier, if you read the stuff by Ojia Femom, he also mentioned how Ojukwu met Azikiwe with the possibility of a coup in 1964. So what have we established so far? We've established the fact that the idea of taking over power for Ojukwu did not start with Biafra. It started in 64. But the question is, why 64? Because something actually happened in 63, just before what happened in 64. What happened in 63 really was that there was a census exercise that was conducted. So I'm looking at the Tragedy of Victory by Brigadier General Godwin Alabi Sama. It says, the so-called nationalist parties from the eastern and western parts of the country, that those who really fought for independence, which had most of the western educated people, were still bickering and at each other's throats, while the MPC continued to consolidate its hold on power and organize the country not only on regional but on religious lines as well. The NCNC in particular could not believe what happened in the election results. Their resentment was blatant, and that was the beginning of the crisis. To make matters worse, the census figures of 1961, the first after independence, was more shocking than the election itself. The northern region had a population of 29.7 million, the western Nigeria had 12.7 million, the east had 12.4 million. Lagos had 665,246 people, less than a million. Please stay with me. The total population of Nigeria stood at 55 million. Hell was let loose.